The galactic court ringed the dead moon, and the chamber throbbed like a heart that refused mercy. Elias Ward knelt, chains humming, as cold halos crowned the judges. Magistrate Karen said, "Humanity stands for extinction." The words fell like iron rain. Billions watched from orbiting fleets while banners of alien law bled across the air. Admiral Corin Hale said, "Compliance preserves scraps," and his medals looked like currency paid in shame. Mara Voss said, "He speaks only to delay the inevitable," and the gallery answered with stillness. Elias tasted copper and dust, and he steadied his breath against the weight of a species. From the dim tier, Lyra Thane said, "Endure and listen." The chamber held its breath as the verdict coiled, and something older than fear woke behind Elias's eyes. Silence clung like frost as the chamber resumed its pulse, and Elias held still because stillness felt like the only shield. Magistrate Karan said, "Your kind writes history in ash," and the words sought to make him smaller than breath. Mara Voss said, "Admit guilt and shorten the spectacle," and the gallery looked hungry for simple endings. Elias remembered rain on a burned street and a child's hand slipping from his grasp. He tasted the failure like old smoke, and he measured his fear against the scale of uncounted eyes. Admiral Hale said, "Dignity is a luxury we can no longer pay," and the medals scratched softly when he moved. Lyra Thane said, "Mercy survives in cracks others overlook," and her voice threaded a path he could step upon. The tribunal lights brightened, as if dawn could rise inside metal bones. Elias said, "Do not mistake grief for guilt," and he drew breath that did not break. The chamber listened, if only to weigh his audacity. Evidence rippled across the air like storms caught in glass, and every atrocity wore a human face. Elias felt each image like a bruise pressed fresh, and he willed his heart to count slower. Mara Voss said, "Passions prove intent," and she smiled like a knife set down carefully. Admiral Hale said, "Stand aside and survive," and the words sounded borrowed. Magistrate Karen said, "The sum condemns the part," and the chamber agreed because it was easier. Lyra Thane said, "Context bleeds when cut to fit," and the whisper rang truer than gongs. Elias remembered hands lifting rubble and bread shared at midnight and fires quenched by strangers. He saw rescue stitched between horrors, and he held that thread like a lifeline. Screens flashed brighter, as if outrage needed light to breathe. Elias said, "We rise from our wreckage," and the floor seemed to steady under him. The verdict scaffold unfolded from the ceiling like ribs, and the chamber dimmed to a color that meant ending. Elias marked exits he could never reach, because planning was the habit that kept him whole. Magistrate Karen said, "Sentence is ready to be sealed," and the words clicked like locks. Mara Voss said, "Witness, speak your last," and her voice carried a practiced pity. Admiral Hale said, "This spares multitudes," and his gaze slid away from any mirror. Lyra Thane said, "Truth resists collapse," and the whisper set a lantern in his chest. Elias remembered Ava's laugh, small and bright against sirens and smoke. He refused to kneel deeper than the chain required, and the floor hummed like a warning-turned prayer. Elias said, "I will not make your story easier," and the chamber found new edges. A hush swept the tears, as if sound itself bowed, and the echo of judgment waited to be born. Elias drew one long breath and felt the chain as a line he could cross inside. Magistrate Karen said, "Kneel and accept memory's erasure," and silence bent toward obedience. Lyra Thane said, "Stand inside your name," and the whisper threaded his muscles with fire. Mara Voss said, "Dignity is a costume," and her smile asked the crowd to laugh. Admiral Hale said, "We cannot afford defiance," and the words trembled like thin glass. Elias rose to a half-stand against the pull, and the chain sang a bright metallic note. He lifted his chin and met the gaze of a billion unseen witnesses. Elias Ward said, "You will remember this defiance longer than my death," and the chamber learned how silence breaks. Cold light washed the cell, and memory opened like a bruise Elias Ward could not shield. He remembered a street of ash where rain hissed on wire. Ava laughed once under a tarp, and the sound made Ruin step back. Elias Ward said, "Hold tight," and her fingers slipped, because sirens made shadows jump. The tribunal's hum became that siren, steady and cruel in his skull. Magistrate Karan said, "Attachment clouds reason," and the word reason felt emptier than smoke. Maravos said, "He clings to grief as alibi," and the gallery nodded as if grief were a trick. Admiral Corin Hale said, "Survival costs confession," and the medals on his chest chimed like small coins. Lyra Thane said, "Grief is a map when others are lost," and the whisper steadied his lungs. Elias lifted his gaze and placed Ava's smile between himself and the dawn of extinction. Memory turned its page to a checkpoint where trust died and uniforms lied. Elias Ward said, "We were allies," and the rifles answered with paperwork and ropes. The squad leader smiled the way a door closes. Maravos said, "Order requires sacrifice," and the word sacrifice sounded rehearsed. Admiral Corin Hale said, "Stand down to save lives," and the promise came wrapped in numbers. Elias remembered the ledger of faces signed away under floodlights. He felt the knot of the rope again, and he saw the pen that made it lawful. Magistrate Karen said, "Your species codifies cruelty," and the chamber found comfort in symmetry. Lyra Thane said, "Some laws are prisons painted white," and the whisper cut through old fog. Elias chose the memory that hurt most, because the wound proved a heart still working. Elias traced the ladder of scars like constellations that promised direction. Cold training yards returned, where wind carved resolve into bone. Instructor voices were iron filings, pulled by a magnet named fear. Elias Ward said again, until the word lost edges and became rhythm. Maravos said, "Endurance without obedience is wildfire," and the yard smelled of metal rain. Admiral Corin Hale said, "We need soldiers who bow cleanly," and the cadence drilled silence into tongues. Magistrate Karen said, "Pain is data," and the phrase tried to turn blood into math. Lyra Thane said, "Pain also keeps memory alive," and the yard warmed by a breath no one saw. Elias learned the trick of standing after falling, and the standing felt like a kind of language. The tribunal gave a recess that felt like a trap disguised as mercy. In a corridor of glass, Admiral Corin Hale walked beside Elias like a shadow with rank. Admiral Corin Hale said, "Sign and live," and the words smelled of paper and winter. Elias Ward said, "What remains after that life?" and the question fogged the pain. Maravos said, "He mistakes pride for virtue, from a doorway cut like a wound." Magistrate Karen said, "Observe the bargaining rituals," and the ceiling lights hummed a cold hymn. Lyra Thane said, "Choose a rope woven from your own thread," and the whisper steadied the floor. Elias thought of Ava and the ledger, and he weighed breath against name. He walked back toward judgment without the pen. Night pooled in the cell like ink deciding what to write. Elias sat with the chain slack and listened to the tribunal breathe through vents. Lyra Thane stood at the lattice where shadows braid. Lyra Thane said, "Your scars and your voice are the same road," and the line carried him through a narrow place. Elias Ward said, "I am tired of paying with names," and the syllables shook but did not break. Magistrate Karen said, "Dawn brings ceiling," from a distant speaker that refused compassion. Maravos said, "Make it easy," and the words wore velvet over glass. Admiral Corin Hale said, "I cannot help you after morning," and the truth in it weighed more than threat. Elias closed his eyes and rehearsed the rise that would cost everything, and buy more than breath. Morning bled into the chamber like ice, and the screens bloomed with curated ruin. Magistrate Karen said, "Exhibits commence," and the word felt like a blade with a number. Maravos said, "Observe the pattern," and her fingers stitched wars into a single cloth. Admiral Corin Hale said, "The calculus is clear," though his eyes tallied ghosts. Elias Ward remembered hands passing water along a smoking stair. He tasted ash and heard someone laugh because they were still alive. Lyra Thane said, "A mosaic omits the grout," and the whisper named what held mercy together. Images stacked until breath grew thin, and silence weighed more than steel. Elias Ward said, "Show the rescues you cropped away," and the gallery tilted toward doubt. A new reel spilled fabrications that wore truth like a mask, and the crowd leaned in hungry. Mara Voss said, "Intent crowns the evidence," and the crown glittered with borrowed gems. Magistrate Karen said, "Probability convicts," and the numbers marched in lockstep. Admiral Corin Hale said, "This is persuasive," but the word bent under its own weight. Elias Ward remembered forged reports that saved a coward and buried a nurse. The memory smelled of ink and winter light on broken glass. Lyra Thane said, "Look for seams in the costume," and the whisper traced a line across the lie. Elias Ward said, "Freeze frame 31," and the screen hiccuped on a doctored edge. The chamber felt a hairline crack widen. Technicians were summoned like priests to a failing altar, and codes spilled in luminous threads. Magistrate Karen said, "Authenticate," and silence took notes. Mara Voss said, "The core remains unshaken," though her voice looked for a chair. Admiral Corin Hale said, "If forged, then by whom?" and the question walked barefoot. Elias Ward remembered a call sign tied to a ghost payroll. He followed that scent like rain chasing dust. Lyra Thane said, "Names hide in the algebra," and the whisper pointed at the margin. The log unmasked a route that bypassed audit, and the air cooled. Elias Ward said, "Your clean hands share a glove," and the gallery shifted like gravel under a step. The chamber demanded a culprit, and hunger wore the mask of virtue. Mara Voss said, "Human factions doctored records," and her certainty reached for applause. Admiral Corin Hale said, "We have saboteurs among us," and the words looked at their own boots. Magistrate Karen said, "Motive is survival," and the verdict tried to right itself. Elias Ward remembered a liaison who smiled too quickly near sealed terminals. The smile had the shine of rain on oil. Lyra Thane said, "Follow the quiet door," and the whisper slid beneath alarms. Elias Ward said, "Open the access logs for the shadow port," and the floor seemed to listen. A gate, no one admitted knowing, lit like a confession. The hidden channel traced to a name that tasted like rust on Elias's tongue. The archive spoke in timestamps that skipped only when someone powerful walked by. Magistrate Karen said, "Proceed to attribution," and the word fell like a gate. Mara Voss said, "This is noise," though her pulse tapped in her throat. Admiral Corin Hale said, "Who stands behind that seal?" and the room forgot to breathe. Lyra Thane said, "Truth arrives on torn shoes," and the whisper felt like rain after sirens. Elias Ward said, "Bring forward the liaison Ione crest," and a hush unfolded. The gallery sensed blood in the water, and the water sensed it too. The tribunal replaced argument with ordeal, and the floor unfolded into a corridor of knives made legal. Magistrate Karen said, "Strength proves guilt or grace," and his mantle clicked like distant hail. Mara Voss said, "Observe the human threshold," and her eyes measured him like a ledger. Admiral Corin Hale said, "Endure only what you must," and the advice wore fear like a coat. Lyra Thane said, "Breathe between blades," and the whisper braided courage into his ribs. Elias Ward stepped forward as rings of light narrowed, and the chain shortened with him. Pain arrived, the way dawn does, indifferent and complete. He counted heartbeats, and remembered rain that refused to stop. Elias Ward said, "You will not write me hollow," and the corridor swallowed the echo without victory. Gravity spiked without warning, and Elias felt his bones learn the language of stone. Magistrate Karen said, "Acceleration phase," and the chamber leaned with clinical interest. Mara Voss said, "Note the failure curve," and her voice tried to be the floor. Admiral Corin Hale said, "Hold your breath at the crest," and the words tried to help without being caught. Lyra Thane said, "Find the quiet beneath the pull," and calm opened a narrow door. Elias Ward bent, then straightened through the crush, and his vision filled with white noise. He set a pace that answered pain with pattern. He He remembered lifting beams with strangers who had no names. Elias Ward said, "We carry together even when alone," and the crowd found itself listening. The next trial was water without mercy, a column rising to erase breath and doubt. Magistrate Karen said, "Purification phase," and the word pretended to bless. Mara Voss said, "Confess and surface," and her certainty tried to replace air. Admiral Corin Hale said, "Signal if you break," and shame shadowed the offer. Lyra Thane said, "Count the bubbles like seconds you will keep," and the whisper steadied his lungs. Elias Ward slipped beneath the glassy wall and held the memory of Ava's laugh like a buoy. Muscles burned, and the chain tugged like a clock. He rose without surrender, and the column folded into rain. Elias Ward said, "Pain is not your author," and the chamber missed a heartbeat. When the locks disengaged, a figure arrived whose smile already knew the outcome. Ione Crest said, "Justice travels faster with a guide," and the guide wore another leash. Magistrate Karen said, "Witness liaison authenticated," and the stamp echoed like a gavel inside bone. Mara Voss said at last, "Clarity," and relief glittered like broken glass. Admiral Corin Hale said, "Explain the anomalies," and hope stepped back from the edge. Lyra Thane said, "Listen," for the hinge in her voice, and the whisper marked a door. Elias Ward knew the perfume of that signature from sealed nights. Ione Crest said, "Humanity fears light," and the screens prepared to lie beautifully. Elias Ward said, "Truth fears you," and the chamber turned its face. The reveal unfurled like wire from a wound, and the wire spelled names. Ione Crest said, "The edits were mine by directive," and the word directive smelled of cold runes. Magistrate Karen said, "Identify the issuer," and even his calm stepped closer. Mara Voss said, "Show the chain of command," and her tablet brightened like dawn. Admiral Corin Hale said, "Who hides behind your seal?" and the question shook the rail. Lyra Thane said, "Shadows speak in plural," and the whisper gathered weight. Elias Ward said, "Bring the hidden architect to light," and the ceiling answered with a silhouette that bent geometry. The gallery tasted fear and metal. Ione Crest smiled and called the shadow by name, and the name arrived without a face. The chamber swelled with a hush that carried like tide, and Elias Ward stood as far as the chain allowed. He faced the dome where fleets hung like frost on night. Elias Ward said, "Hear what your numbers never count," and breath returned to Rose that had forgotten it. He named a baker who shared bread in a burning stairwell. He named a diver who stitched air to a stranger's lungs. Mara Voss said, "Sentiment masks danger," and her voice tried to sand the edge from truth. Admiral Corin Hale said, "Let him finish," and surprise walked the rail. Magistrate Karen said, "Proceed," though the word arrived slower than before. Lyra Thane said, "Say the names that were not invited," and the whisper rose like dawn. Elias Ward said, "We rise because we remember," and the screens dimmed to listen. A glyph awakened above Elias like a star remembering its name, and the dome sang in harmonics older than law. Magistrate Karen said, "Identify this resonance," and even his mantle paused. Mara Voss said, "Diversion," yet her eyes chased the pattern. Admiral Corin Hale said, "I have seen that crest in deep archives," and dust blew through his voice. Lyra Thane said, "It is the trail mark of first voyagers," and the whisper fit the glyph like a key. The symbol mirrored the scar at Elias's brow, and the chamber leaned as if pulled. Elias Ward said, "My blood kept a map your empire forgot," and the silence bent toward awe. The glyph unraveled roots that laced unknown dark. Elias Ward said, "We are not accidents," and the dome flickered like a memory pleased to be found. The fleets receiving the broadcast shifted like shoals when the deep rolls, and doubt traveled faster than orders. Mara Voss said, "Cut external feeds," and the command hit a wall that did not move. Admiral Corin Hale said, "If they see, they will decide," and his words tasted of risk he could live with. Magistrate Karen said, "Maintain decorum," though the chamber had already changed shape. Lyra Thane said. The truth is moving between hulls, and the whisper felt like rain waking streets. Elias Ward said, we mapped the dark by dying in it, and the dome answered with echoes from the fleets. Some banners lowered a fraction as if muscles unclenched. The gallery leaned toward the sound that sounded like future. The shot arrived like a decision with no voice, and it chose Elias' heart. Ione Crest said, order demands silence, and the words hid behind the muzzle of light. Admiral Corin Hale sat down, but the warning could not outrun fire. Lyra Thane stepped between breath and beam with a motion that forgave nothing. Lyra Thane said, let the living keep the path, and her whisper burned brighter than the wound. Magistrate Karen said, cease fire, and command finally sounded like need. Mara Voss said, this was not sanctioned, though the sanction bled in the air. Elias Ward caught Lyra as if catching a star falling wrong. He felt the glow fade like a tide that loved the shore. The floor rang with alarms that sounded like choices, and the tears fractured into argument. Lyra Thane said, carry the lantern, and the whisper thinned like a thread that would not snap. Elias Ward set her gently down and faced the world that wanted to forget. Admiral Corin Hale said, stand with him, and the rail bristled with nervous courage. Mara Voss said, arrest them all, and the order wandered looking for a spine. Magistrate Karen said, the witness may speak, and he finally looked like a judge instead of a blade. Elias Ward said, we are not asking for mercy. We are demanding recognition, and the words climbed the dome. The fleets answered by cutting engines to listen. The chamber learned the shape of a future spoken aloud. Sirens braided with prayer as the tribunal returned, and the air smelled of hot metal and fear. Magistrate Karen said, verdict is extermination, and the word struck like iron on water. Mara Voss said, proceed to execution protocol, and her voice kept perfect time. Admiral Corin Hale said, you will tear the fleets apart, and truth leaned into his breath. Elias Ward remembered Lyra's fall, and felt resolve occupy Payne's empty room. Ione Crest said, order requires closure, and the syllables wore velvet gloves. Lyra Thane said, stand inside your name, and the whisper flickered, but did not dim. The gallery divided like ice under weight, and banners trembled. The hidden architects said, fear is the engine, and shadows folded like wings. Elias Ward said, engines can stall when memory cuts fuel, and the chamber shifted toward storm. The verdict rippled to the fleets, and hull lights flickered like thoughts changing their minds. Mara Voss said lock channels and commands scattered like birds under engines. Admiral Corin Hale said, stand down and witness, and courage found a place to sit. Magistrate Karen said, contain the contagion of doubt, and the order wore clinical frost. Ione Crest said, protocol gamma, and hidden guns woke like old wolves. Lyra Thane said, do not trade breath for silence, and her whisper crossed the tears softly. The hidden architect said, let panic hunt them, and the dome darkened by one shade. Elias Ward said, look at the hands that lift, not the fists that bind, and screens filled with rescues long cut away. The crowd leaned toward the light that fit the wound. Evidence bled from sealed vaults as if locks remembered their first oaths. Admiral Corin Hale said, open the chain of edits, and the request unlatched old ghosts. Mara Voss said, this chamber will not host rumor, yet her eyes sought exits. Magistrate Karen said, authenticate sources, and technicians moved like careful surgeons. Ione Crest said, you asked for light, and light arrived with teeth. The hidden architect said, truth is a blade I taught them to fear, and geometry bent in the aperture. Lyra Thane said, blades also cut chains, and the whisper warmed like dawn. Elias Ward said, show the signatures, and forgery glowed like oil in rain. The gallery gasped as the plot mapped itself across their faces. The tears erupted as factions declared faith in different mirrors, and order stumbled. Mara Voss said security cordon, and the command found only tired boots. Admiral Corinne Hale said, protect civilians, and shields formed like umbrellas in hail. Magistrate Karen said, this court remains sovereign, and the word sovereign rang hollow. Ione Crest said, withdraw the witness, and hands reached that wore silk over steel. Lyra Thane said, let him stand, and the whisper crossed like a bridge. The hidden architect said, I will erase the questioner, and the lights fell one row at a time. Elias Ward said, you will remember this defiance longer than my death, and the dome caught the sentence like fire. The chaos paused to listen. Silence gathered its strength and pressed the hall flat, and choice stepped forward alone. Magistrate Karen said, stay the execution, and the word stay healed one crack. Mara Voss said, you abandon the mandate, and her certainty searched for walls. Admiral Corin Hale said, history is watching, and the fleets dimmed their engines to hear. Ione Crest said, this court will drown in sentiment, and the tone wore polished ice. Lyra Thane said, justice breathes when fear exhales, and breath returned to the tears. The hidden architect said, memory will not save you, and geometry shivered around its edges. Elias Ward said, memory already has, and the crowd answered with a stillness that chose life. The chamber learned a new gravity that did not kill. Dawn unstitched the smoke, and the tribunal looked smaller under honest light. Magistrate Karen said, sanctions replace extinction, and the word sanctions felt heavy but alive. Mara Voss said, history will regret leniency, and her gaze tried to harden the day. Admiral Corin Hale said, history will breathe, and relief shook his shoulders once. Lyra Thane lay steady as medics worked silence into her pain. Ione Crest said, control bends, it never breaks, and confidence clung like frost. The hidden architect said, witness the leash, and geometry thinned into a threat at the dome. Elias Ward said, a leash still needs a hand, and the chamber understood which hands would be seen. Ships rotated from attack stance to watchful orbit, and the world learned to count slower. Outside the dome, fleets drifted like great seeds, choosing where to land their vows. Admiral Corin Hale said, we escort, not erase, and signal flags answered with quiet engines. Mara Voss said, contain their reach, and drones formed a ring that called itself peace. Magistrate Karen said, oversight begins, and his mantle hung heavier than law. Lyra Thane said, guard does not mean cage, and her whisper traveled beyond glass. Ione Crest said, we will curate memory, and curating felt like trimming a living tree. The hidden architect said, fear will bloom again, and the bloom looked pale under daylight. Elias Ward said, we will water what survives, and the phrase stood like a promise he could lift. The dome opened to a sky that held both threat and weather. In a quiet ward, Elias held the moment like fragile metal, cooling to shape. Lyra Thane said, you carried the lantern, and the lantern sounded like breath shared slowly. Elias Ward said, you stepped between name and night, and gratitude found a seat. Admiral Corin Hale said, there will be inquiries, and the word inquiries wore careful boots. Mara Voss said, I will file dissent, and the page already knew her signature. Magistrate Karen said, balance demands witness, and he looked older than verdicts. Ione Crest said, truth is a tool, and her pause added edges to the claim. The hidden architect said, tools turn from a speaker that tasted of dust. Machines hummed a soft promise that healing might keep. The court reconvened to bind survival to conditions that tasted like wire under the tongue. Magistrate Karen said, humanity will live under chartered watch, and the charters spread wings that were also fences. Mara Voss said, violations end the reprieve, and silence weighed her scale. Admiral Corin Hale said, we accept oversight, not erasure, and his voice kept the door from closing. Ione Crest said, I will audit the auditors, and paperwork smiled. Lyra Thane said, let the wounded teach the guards, and the whisper softened iron. The hidden architect said, I will wait, and waiting moved like deep water. Elias Ward said, We will answer with work and witness, and the phrase stood up straight. Pens moved, and the future signed for its package without opening it. When the crowds thinned, Elias walked the cracked flagstones where stars pooled like coins. Admiral Corin Hale said, "You bought time, and time felt heavier than armor." Mara Voss said, "Time can be revoked," and Warning wore a careful smile. Magistrate Karen said, "Remember why you were spared," and his voice chose humility. Ione Crest said, "We will meet again where records sleep," and promise tasted metallic. Lyra Thane said, "Carry the lantern until others can," and the lantern warmed his scars. The hidden architect said, "I am the echo you cannot mute," and the echo faded into distance. He stood alone, and looked up at the dark that had learned his name. They wanted a verdict. What they got was a warning.